What's good, everybody? What's good, YouTube family? I thought it would be a great idea to cover, a little bit of the gender wars going on, but as of course, that's not the focus of this channel. But I think it gives a great background to the current state of Black people in America. The reason why I thought it was important, as we've seen on YouTube, there's been an explosion of the manosphere content. There's different channels. Of course, there was Kevin Samuels before. There's the Fresh and Fit podcast. There's Beast Mode Smooth Reacts. There's Mediocre Tutorials and Reviews. There's a lot of different channels. And shout out to all those guys. And they create a lot of great content on the manosphere, which is a growing space, on YouTube, that's serving a great audience. But as of course, the approach of this channel, we're not, this channel is not as concerned with manosphere content as it's more concerned with approaching scholarly content that explains the sociological situation that we see within the Americas, particularly among African Americans and other African diaspora groups, and also diaspora or groups that are descendants of the original indigenous people of the Americas. So that's really the angle that I'm getting at here. By getting into this content, I want to share some of O'Shea Duke Jackson's video discussing how the system started the gender war between the black man and black woman, because I think that's an important aspect to cover, to kind of see why is Black America in the state that it is now. And yes, I am focusing on Black America in this video, but why is Black America in the state that it is now in terms of the relationships between the man and woman, and the impact that has on the wider community in terms of leaving us more vulnerable, giving and also giving kids like a less stable home. So anyway, I'm not gonna do too much introduction, but let's get into it, guys.
We have the legendary Honorable Dr. T. Hassan Johnson. Finally, it's been years. I've known about him. He known about me.
So we're gonna skip ahead.
That's the kind of perspective I've noticed. It's really gotten to be very kind of deeply ensconced in our relationships.
So with that, we'll kind of get into the presentation, which is policy undermining the gender war. And I would say what you described is what it is. It's a gender war. How has policy shaped this particular divide between African American men and Black women?
Well, I think the biggest thing it does is it really incites a different set of expectations rooted in a different quality of life, right? Prior to the 1960s, when we talked about Black life, there were some differences, between what Black men and women went through, but I think it really got exacerbated after the 60s, where you started to see a serious shift, right? So if you talked about, say, if we just start with welfare, right? For the most part, many of us are familiar with the man in the house rule, where, if you were going to get welfare for the family, you couldn't have a man present. And they would actually send social workers to your home who would go through your closets, go through your bathrooms. They'd look for men's razors, men's clothes and shoes. They would check for it. And they would even talk to neighbors to see if the neighbors would tell them if you had a man there as a woman. So, this man in the house rule is really deep in terms of how it's separated many Black families and removed men from the home. And if you're moving from the South, because that's what a lot of us did. It was a great migration after World War II. We're moving to the urban North and the Midwest, and we're looking for jobs, right? Because you can get a factory job, especially during World War II when white workers were drafted overseas. You can come get a factory job and a union membership, which meant that people couldn't just arbitrarily fire you because you were Black if you had union membership. And even though many unions were racist, it was still a big deal to be able to get that. So we moved to the so-called North in extreme numbers, in waves, in fact, right? And when we got up here, especially after World War II, when those soldiers came back and took their jobs, many of us didn't want to go back down South. So the birth of the ghetto in urban cities comes about from us not wanting to leave and looking for opportunities, because what was waiting in the South for the most part, it was sharecropping, and we weren't trying to go back to that. So the ghetto comes about when in urban cities begin to push black folk into certain sections of the city that weren't going to leave, and so you could still kind of eke out a living if you could, but for the most part, people needed welfare. And basically the way it was practiced is it separated men out of the home and left men to fend for themselves. And this is when you start to see a shift in the quality of life and in more of an extreme level between black men and women. Women had what I call a glass floor that allowed them to only go down so far, and men had nothing. You just had to go out and scrape and scratch for whatever. So that was the beginning point. And with that quality, that difference in quality of life, black men and women began to actually see things very differently. Right? Black men knew they weren't going to get any support. Nobody was coming. If you were starving, if you were out of work, nobody was really coming for you. It was different, for black women. So that was the beginning point. And, a lot of this begins to accumulate over time, right? It begins to accumulate over time. So we're living in an era where you have women that have seen their grandmothers as head of household, their mothers as head of their households. They're the head of their households. They're anticipating that their daughters are going to be the head of their households. These kind of ideas get passed down, and they really begin to separate our experiences.
Now that was the beginning. If we could talk about it in phases. So right. What can we approximate a year or years when this first phase you just described happened? What was the approximation of the year?
We can talk about this in terms of the early 60s and coming in and through the 1970s. But one of the things we start to notice toward the end of the 70s and the 80s is college access, right, for black women. Now, this is at the same time we have the war on drugs that's coming in, initiated by Nixon in many ways. And the way it impacts the black community, of course, is first, we lose jobs, right? We experience deindustrialization. Jobs are now going overseas. So black men, our work strategies were rarely in education because that's not where we were ever really supported. Right? Even to this day, black males are pushed into special ed at record numbers. So at that time, our work strategy was you may finish high school, but you don't really have to, but you do need to work. So that was our strategy to find work. And once those jobs dried up, those blue collar factory jobs, you had the war on drugs. You had this influx in drugs, and that became the economy that many black men went into. But it resulted in either death or incarceration, right? And when you talk about incarceration, when those numbers began to expand, that took black men out of many different spaces. You were physically removed. You couldn't vote when you got out. You were lucky to find employment when you got out. And if you went in with a high school diploma or less, you were statistically tied to low wages for the rest of your life. So these again, this is where you start to see a split, because now black women are going to college in higher and higher numbers, and they're transitioning into white collar jobs. Because, really at the end of the 1960s, you had white women and second wave feminism coming in saying we need to work. Well, black women were able to ride that wave as well. And they were transitioning from domestic labor to white collar jobs, while many black men were going from blue collar work to unemployment to the drug world. And so this begins this dramatic split. And what it results in is you have black women on two tiers. You have poor black women, and you have working class to middle class black women. Poor black women had welfare access, which provided them a basic floor. They weren't going to be sleeping on park benches with three kids. You know what I'm saying? They had a floor. They had a place they could live. They had utilities. They had food. There was a basic floor that they had. If you were a man and you were homeless, you were just out. Now, working class to middle class black women had college access. So they were going to school. Right. And with going to school, especially with other groups of women who came from, class backgrounds that were a little more secure, they got used to seeing and began to expect a certain quality of life, right? That many black men couldn't fathom. I mean, we literally have half the degrees black women have. From 1976 to 2018, we got half the degrees that black women have. So they were introduced, especially during school, they were introduced to feminism. That's one thing. That's a whole thing unto itself. Mainly through universities. And then the other thing they were introduced to was this white collar dream. right? This two picket fence American dream kind of idea that came through, associating with these white collar, middle class, kind of folk. This is what the university does. It introduces you to these ideas and to people who've lived that life. So you have black women on those two tiers, and they're looking for, black men that can meet this expectation that they've developed. But much of what they expect from black men is rooted in advantage that they've had that black men don't. And the ridiculous part of it is many are oblivious to the fact that men don't have the same opportunities, right? So this becomes the split that takes place. And now so by the time you get to the 1980s, you're hearing this language quite regularly. Niggas ain't I don't need a man. I'm an independent, strong black woman. And then from the 80s to the late 2000s or 2015 afterward, you start to hear black girl magic, but this comes out of the same type of advantage that black women have grown very comfortable with. And from there's a certain type of entitlement that I would argue that comes with that. And even a kind of solipsism, right? Which is basically, no one else really, if you're solipsistic, basically no one else exists but you and others like you. You start to see this kind of language in black women really only talking to each other. And when it comes to black men, the only conversation that you really kind of hear is what's expected of us. But what's expected of us is rooted in their imagination and not tied to reality, which is why Kevin is so important. Kevin Samuel's show is so important because we hear call after call after call how unrealistic these expectations are. And then Kevin hits him with the data. Like, okay, how is it that you want 1% of men and you're not bringing anything to the table that's anywhere near 1%?
All right, guys, so I'm gonna stop it there. Shout out to Dr. T. Hassan Johnson. I really like this show on the O'Shea Duke Jackson channel. He really broke down a lot of big things. And I believe he's a specialist in Africana studies, PhD, and he has a center for black male studies, I believe, was something that he mentioned in the video. So definitely very interesting. I wanted to break down some of what he said though, because there was a lot of information. I let it play for a while because he really dropped a lot of valuable information. So really, the main points that he was explaining was that there was a creation of two different expectations because of the nature of the history, right? He put out some historical events. First was World War II, which caused a huge rush of workers to come to the industrial areas of the United States, Chicago, New York, many of the other industrial areas, you name it. They needed women because a lot of the, eligible young men, especially white men, had gone off to war, like a pretty large percentage. So they needed women, and also people or black people could fill those jobs too, or the people of color could fill those jobs too. Hispanics or whoever, could fill those jobs. And getting those jobs were, relatively easy for a black person at that time in terms of, there was a demand for the labor. And the union would provide certain protections which they didn't have before, working as sharecroppers in the Jim Crow South. So, excuse me, guys, I have a bit of a cough here, sinus issues, but we'll get through this. So, we had a process that created a situation that was creating two different expectations, and that was the beginning. So he was setting it up. But so the war is what drew a lot of people, in terms of the Great Migration to the North. After the war ends, a lot of the soldiers returning, they want their jobs back. A lot of people get laid off in terms of the ladies, they're getting laid off. And of course, the black people, they're going to get laid off. So it leaves a lot of people in a situation where they don't want to leave the North, right? Because there's certain protections, there's a lifestyle that they've become used to and accustomed to. Because the only other option is to go back down to the Jim Crow South that they were escaping. So it just left them with the option of staying in the city and kind of getting along the best way they can and finding what job they could, although those jobs were lower paying, lower wage. And there we get the gradual development of what we see today. And he mentioned the welfare movement or the welfare program that was in existence at that time. And yeah, you guys should do some more research on it if you're interested. But I believe it started in the 50s or 60s or somewhere in that time. And you had the men outside of the house rule that he mentioned for welfare, and that there were, in order to receive these welfare checks, you couldn't have a man in the house. They would bring social workers by to check if there was a man, because it was assumed if there was a man there, he's supposed to be supporting everything. And of course, it was very difficult for a lot of African American men to find jobs at that time. Like I said, the war had ended, and a lot of those industrial jobs were returning to those returning soldiers. And of course, they were igniting racial tensions as well. You could definitely be fired because just, hey, the guys on the job don't like you. We don't want to work with a black dude. So, that was definitely an issue. And you had a lot of qualified men who couldn't find work for racial issues. So, yeah, there was the men outside of the house rule for welfare, which created an incentive to get the men out of the house. And during this time, there's a change with black women in terms of they were given like a guaranteed floor. That was one of the things he mentioned. They were given a guaranteed floor. The welfare provided a guaranteed floor for them, where they always had they had a basic floor of income. Yeah, they had a basic floor of income. So it created a difference in quality of life. The man didn't have that. He had to get out there and earn whatever in whatever way he could. And so also during this time, gradually, I would say maybe starting in the 60s, but definitely starting in the late 60s to early 70s, you start getting a drying up of blue-collar jobs. The blue-collar jobs are starting to get shipped overseas, especially in the 1970s. Because, and this is a gradual process. It happens over a very long time. But that's when the opening up of China happens during that time. A lot of developments happen where they start shipping off manufacturing jobs and, heavy industry jobs, blue-collar jobs. They start shipping this off shipping it overseas. So of course this is affecting America at large, but in terms of how it affected the black community, blue-collar jobs are drying up, and there was no previous tradition of, black men overall. Of course there was always those outliers within the black community, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Charles Hamilton, Houston Thurgood Marshall. I mean, we can name the list, but when you really think about it, that list was small relative to the overall population of black men. But anyway, there was never really a huge tradition of going to college and getting educated. You just acquired a skill, you worked a blue-collar job, or you just went to work, even if it wasn't necessarily applying a particular skill or profession. You just went to work and made your money. And so it was basically coming out of an era that valued blue-collar or manual labor, and where that type of labor was paid well, an old era. So because that tradition wasn't there, okay, it doesn't perpetuate into the future. It doesn't change for the future. Actually, the old tradition does perpetuate into the future, and there is no change. That's what I meant to say. But the development that does happen is black women more and more start to go to college, because with the rise of second wave feminism, there's a greater demand of women getting into the workplace, having opportunity. So this creates an opportunity for black women to say, hey, I can go to college, I can get an office job, I can become a typist or something like that, get some training, whatever it may be. And so black women start to go to college, and they start to get white-collar jobs, and so their pay is higher or starts to become higher relative to black men. Yeah, their pay becomes higher relative to black men. So as black women are going to college and their lives are becoming more secure, they begin to expect more. They begin to expect a certain life because they're exposed to college-educated people. They're in a college environment. They're, and of course, people, they have a different lifestyle. They've been exposed to different things, and so it starts to change their expectations. And then in the 80s, you start to get language such as, jiggas ain't shit, or in the 90s, black girl magic, and all this type of stuff. So that's where kind of the background and the fundamental shift is happening. And so I just wanted to lay that out for you guys. I thought it was interesting, but I'm going to play a little bit more because Dr. T. Hassan Johnson really lays out a lot of different things here. So I'm going to let him fast forward a little bit and let him get to the next point.
Propagated in the university system, right? When you had black girls going to college in record numbers. One of the narratives they got was that they were oppressed, but they were oppressed by black men. So this is black feminists in particular, right? So they have this narrative that they really take on from white feminists, which is that all women are oppressed by men and by patriarchy. And so they bring that narrative into the black community and say, well, because we're women, we're oppressed by black patriarchy, which doesn't exist. It never has. There's never been a time period where black men have ruled over black women in mass. It doesn't work like that. Most of the time, when you talk to someone who's making that argument, 99% of the time, when you ask them for examples of this patriarchy, they will give you anecdotes about abuse or rape by one black male that did something to one black woman. But black men have never benefited from any kind of structural patriarchy. If you commit a crime, you don't avoid jail time because you're privileged as a man. It doesn't happen. Black men have never enjoyed that, but that's the accusation. And so because of that accusation, the narrative that black women even pass down to their own daughters, they pass it down intellectually in academics, is that you are oppressed, you need to be liberated from black men, and you need to be able to stand on your own. And so what you see is they create, I would say over 90% of my black female students, when they work on projects or write papers, it's overwhelmingly about black women, right? So if they develop opportunities, it's about black women. And if you go and look in Goldman Sachs, look in these other programs, what you'll find is there's a woman that's working there, a black woman who is developing resources or trying to get the institution she works for to target resources at other black women. So this is what I mean about a black female solipsism. It's really, they're pushing against this narrative that they are oppressed, particularly by black men, and at all costs, they need to generate resources to help black women. Even if their boys and men are doing worse, they are oblivious to this. They are oblivious. I have seen women who don't even have daughters, who have grown sons, who are living in the park, who are addicted to drugs, and they are going out and starting Black Girl Magic programs to help other girls. Completely oblivious, even when they have sons in their own homes. They've only learned to really see other black women. Men are just kind of background noise, even when it's their own family members. But that's the reality we live in, and all of it is really coming about in response to this narrative that these women have been taught in the university and at home, that they're oppressed, most particularly by black men. And then racism is somewhere in there after that, and they need to have as many resources as possible to defend themselves and be liberated and stand on their own. So this is the kind of narrative, and this is why.
Okay, guys, I kind of want to unpack that a little bit also. So he was touching on this narrative of being oppressed, which comes from the feminists and the ivory tower and the colleges and universities. This historical oppression. It's a very interesting argument. I haven't really pulled it apart fully myself. I know there's people who write about this, or feminist scholars or so on. I'd be interested in going to them, turning to those sources, and picking apart those arguments. But besides all that, This feminist ideology pushed a narrative of historical oppression, and in the context of black women, it was adopted to say that black men, historically, and I'm limiting it right now to the North American continent, that black men have in North America historically oppressed black women. So it's very interesting, and actually Dr. T. Hasan Johnson, he makes a statement in there is, where is the proof? Where is the evidence for this? I don't believe there's any evidence, simply because, if you analyze history, first we started in slavery, in which, we were all, every black person in North America was subjugated in slavery. So there was no, and by the way, the black man did not have control over the black woman. It was in fact the white master who had control over all parties. So I don't think you can make a strong argument, right, that there was a historical oppression there by black men. And then, after, widespread emancipation, 1865, it'd be interesting. I would say bring the evidence. What is the evidence of us, being in a culture or being in a type of practice where all black women were just uniformly oppressed and were, in an oppressive situation where there was a man just taking advantage of their time and, and of their labor and their body. It's a very interesting interpretation. I think it's more of a, it's a flawed interpretation that tries to pit man and women against each other, when in fact it was really just cooperation so that they could get things done. But either way, we'll get to that a little bit in the next video, because I want to cover that some more, at least the scholarly foundations of these feminist movements and, the realization in today's time. So, but anyway, that's what Dr. T. Hasan Johnson mentioned, is that the feminist ideology got into black women through the college environment, giving them the notion that they were oppressed and they have to do whatever they have to do to be independent and fight against it. They don't need a man, so on and so forth. And he also mentioned that how black women are very cooperative and are very good at working together and creating opportunities for each other, yet they ignore black men. And I've seen this personally. I'm sure a lot of you guys in the audience have seen this. You will have, take a particular black family, for example. The daughter is successful, she's pushing it, she's going to college, yet, son is a college dropout, has a kid or something like that, in prison, just a complete, F up, to be frank, and just being completely ignored. Completely irrelevant, just whatever, live your life, kind of thing. It's really baffling and interesting. But anyway, guys, I want to transition from that to Muhammad Hijab, who really, breaks down, the scholarly foundations of all this stuff. The historical and scholarly foundations of these, waves of feminism, which influence the situation that we're seeing now in terms of the relationships between black men and black women in North America. So let me just pull that video up, guys. 1 sec. Alright, this is a video. Muhammad Hijab, who is really like a Islamic lecturer, a bit of a scholar, and he's with the Sapiens Institute, which I believe is based in London. Anyway, he's a very popular YouTuber, also Muslim YouTuber, but he has a very interesting lecture about the really the scholarly foundations of feminism. So I really want to just kind of get into that and get his points across.
(1963). And she famously said that a woman in a house is living in a comfortable concentration camp. One must read Simone de Beauvoir, which I'm sure many of you will be able to access in French even, but who has written The Second Sex, a very important book, and see what kind of arguments that she was making. Second wave conceptions. One must refer back to the 1960s, to the movement, to the literature, to the writings. For example, one must read Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique, 1963. And she famously said that a woman in a house is living in a comfortable concentration camp. One must read Simone de Beauvoir, which I'm sure many of you will be able to access in French even, but who has written The Second Sex, a very important book, and see what kind of arguments that she was making, where she made arguments explicitly, made arguments against conceptions, traditionalist conceptions of the family, of motherhood, etc. One must go back to Germaine Greer, who once again lived at that time and wrote The Female Eunuch. One must go back to these people, and if one does do that, one will realize that there was a very intentional attack on the institution of the family. Now you'll say this is not substantiated. I will say something to you which maybe many of you didn't know. Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1963, some 58 years ago, Betty Friedan herself wrote a book called The Second Sage. She wrote this book in 1981. And in this book, she openly admits, she says, we must look within, relating to how we have actually reduced conceptions of the family. And when commenting on her famous line that the house is a comfortable concentration camp, she refers to her own statement 20 years later as an extreme statement. So by the admission of the authors themselves, there has been a failure. One must also think of something else. Betty Friedan, who wrote this book, who told women that they must prioritize their careers first. This is what they must do. She actually ran some surveys. She was known for doing surveys and doing studies. And to her dismay, she found in the 1970s, she found that women, after the legislative or law changes that took place in America, and by the way, in all of Western Europe as well, that they were suffering more, not less. And that was actually her conclusion. That was her conclusion. And then she says herself, this is Betty Friedan, not Muhammad Hijab, it's not the Muslim fundamentalist, the hate preacher, the extremist, whoever, this one, that one. No, it is Betty Friedan herself. She states that 1/3 of women, she states, 1/3 of women that she surveyed, they suffered from mental breakdown. And this was way more than the surveys that she ran in the 1950s and 60s. So according to her, things were getting worse, not better. According to the feminist, the founding mother of feminism, second wave feminism, things are getting worse, not better. Okay, one will still be skeptical and say, this is maybe not enough of an evidence for me. Germaine Greer, who wrote a book called The Female Eunuch. A eunuch is somebody, is a man who has his private part castrated. Okay? She wrote this book. She was it's satirical. She was trying to make fun of a situation, talking about the woman, basically. And she, in 1981 or 1983, I forget exactly when, she wrote a book called The Whole Woman. And she said something very interesting that I will never forget, because she was advising women not to have children. That's how bad it was. She was saying, women, don't have children. That's what she said. And the reason why she said that is because, just like Simone de Beauvoir, in her book, The Second Sex, if you read the chapter on biology, she believed that it's an oppressive relationship. The moment you become a mother, you're oppressed. You're oppressed by virtue of being a mother. She made this very clear. Germaine Greer, in her book, The Whole Woman, she said, and I quote, this is word for word, she goes, I mourn for my unborn children. Now, what does this mean? When you mourn, you go to the graveyard, you're crying, yeah? All of these things. Now, how can you mourn for your unborn children? She says, I mourn for my unborn children, meaning what? That she regrets not having children. Can you imagine a woman who convinced tens of millions of women not to have children, not to prioritize motherhood, not to engage in career activity, instead and as a substitute to being a mother and a housewife, call it what you want to call it. She herself, 20 years later, that same woman, she says, I regret the situation. I mourn. I mourn. This is strong language. I mourn. I mourn for my unborn children. I wish I had children. This is unfair. That you convince tens of millions of women, yes, you convince tens of millions of women that motherhood is not important, that having a career is, and then she says, I mourn for my unborn children. Now, the same woman, Germaine Greer, she says, now we have to look. Can you imagine she says this? All I'm telling you to do is look at the confessions of the feminists. Forget about me, what I say. Look at the confessions of the feminists. She says, now we have to look at motherhood being a full-time career option. This is exactly what she states. Germaine Greer herself. Simone de Beauvoir, who most of you, maybe you'll know her name a little bit because, you know, she had a boyfriend called Sartre. You know, Jean-Paul Sartre. You may know this guy. Existentialist, you know, and he's French speaking and stuff. So you know who he is, maybe. Put your hands up if you know, if you've heard any of these names before. Okay, we're all on the same page. Maybe not one of them. Anyways, this is what she says. Listen to this, yeah? She's very categorical. Simone de Beauvoir, she's seen as one of the top feminists in the 60s, yeah? I was reading her autobiography because I was interested to see what the kind of woman this is. I was very, very shocked and surprised. I was dismayed, disillusioned. She had an apartment. I think it was either in Paris or New York. I forget where the apartment was. And she was in love with this Sartre, yeah? She was in love with him. He is, by the way, he is the one who told her to write a book on feminism. She writes this in her autobiography. He gave me the idea. And then she says, when he was coming back from wherever he was, going traveling, and now he's coming back. She says, I was cleaning the house. That's the first red flag. I thought, wait a minute here. Am I reading this is from the right pages? Wait a minute, cleaning the house? She goes, yes, I was cleaning the house. I was getting everything ready for him. It's the same woman that's telling you don't be a mother. That, you know, don't you dare do domestic activities. And then I went further and reading. you know what she states, Simone de Beauvoir? She goes, because Sartre is my true superior. I said, this is the mother of feminism saying this. I said, my wife never said anything like that. We're meant to be the traditionalists here. I even showed it to my wife. I said, look what she said. She said, that's her, that's a different story, you know. Even she thought it was too extreme. I mean, what is this? She goes, true superior. So I was wondering, why is it that these founding mothers of feminism, they have one speech to the public, to other women, and another speech in their private life. And I think they know, and we know now that they do, that their theories are false. Now, one of the biggest studies that have, I think.
So that was very interesting. I let that play for a while, about 10 minutes. I let him go on because he was really dropping a lot of interesting things, because he was really setting the stage for the academic scholarly foundations for these ideas of feminism, which would go on to have an effect on black women going to college, you know, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and going forward. So, you know, I just want to mention some of the things he said, because all of these female philosophers, he mentioned names like Simone de Beauvoir, Betty Friedan, also Germaine Greer. Many black women or many women in general in America who repeat these talking points don't know these individuals, but their ideas are influenced by these individuals, which trickle down from the colleges and universities, and of course the works of these three women, you know, likely well known in many women's studies departments throughout the country. So this was the first time I really heard of them, you know, after watching this video. You know, definitely if you guys want to learn more, you know, look up these ladies. But you know, some of the things he mentioned I thought were really interesting is that, you know, he was mentioning Betty Friedan, you know, who wrote The Feminine Mystique, and you know, in that, you know, claim that the house is, you know, basically a concentration camp, something that oppresses the woman, locks her in. You know, we hear a lot of these similar ideas today, but later in a book that she wrote in 1981, The Second Sage, she mentioned that comment was extreme. So she, you know, backtracked her own statement, you know, went against her own statement. So that's very interesting. And you know, she also mentioned that, you know, you should put your career first. But, you know, she also did a lot of sociological studies, as he mentioned, and found that there was more suffering among women after the law changes that allowed for ladies to enter the workforce in greater numbers. And she found that there was a 1/3 of women in the workforce were suffering from a mental breakdown. So, you know, and we go on. You know, he mentions Germaine Greer, who stressed that women should not have children. You know, but later, in a later publication, about 20 years later, she mentions that she mourns for her unborn children. So there again, we have another situation where one of these founding philosophers of feminist ideology or women's studies, whatever you want to call it, is contradicting themselves. You know, contradicting your earlier statement. If it really was the truth, right? If you made the initial statement and it really was the truth, then why contradict yourself later? It doesn't make any sense. So, he also mentions that this individual, Germaine Greer, in this later publication or in this later book, mentions that motherhood should be a full-time option, that women should be able to exercise the ability to take on motherhood as a full-time option. So there again, contradicting herself. And then he goes on to mention Simone de Beauvoir. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that name correctly. But she was a love interest or in a relationship. I believe he mentioned Jean-Paul Sartre. Excuse me for messing up that pronunciation. But and hopefully I got that name correctly. But I do recall hearing that name, Jean-Paul Sartre. And so she was in a relationship with him. I believe he was a famous French philosopher. But she was mentioning in her, in a publication that he was discussing there, that she was cleaning the house, getting things ready for him because they shared an apartment. I believe he mentioned New York or Paris, whichever. But she was cleaning the house, she was getting things ready, and she referred to Saturday as her senior. Now wait a second. That doesn't sound like the typical talking point of a feminist. Especially the type of feminism that these ladies were talking about initially. So, as Muhammad Hijab said, I think that's clear evidence that their theories, that the ideas that they were putting forth were clearly wrong, and clearly against, something that was really like, could be or I would think an internal nature for women, something that is internal to their essence, right? So anyway, I want to get back into it, guys. Muhammad Hijab has a lot of great ideas, so let's get back into it.
This is the biggest study that I've ever seen on the well-being of women. It is called Blanche Flower and Oswald. Blanche Flower and Oswald, these are two names of the people, yeah? And it's a longitudinal study from the years 1970 to 1990. It is the longest study that was conducted on 100,000 women. Are there some feminists out there chanting? They know what I'm about to say. That's why they're doing that. I'm about to drop facts. I'm about to drop bombs. No, I don't mean those kinds of bombs. I know the SS are here, the secret services. But let me repeat this point because it's imperative. It's very important. The biggest study that has ever been done to my knowledge, was it conducted by some anti-feminists or did this person? No, it was conducted by people who are neutral to this whole situation. They wanted to find out. The question they wanted to know was, are feministic policies now that have now been enacted, are they making women's lives easier or are they making their lives harder? This is the question. They want to find out. Is the career path a path that's making women's lives, is it making it easier or is it making it harder? They had a sample of 100,000 women. That's huge. 20 years from 1970 to 1990. And the conclusion was that the well-being of women has deteriorated. This is an incredible conclusion. It is the biggest study that has ever been done on this point, and it has shown that feministic policies, that women going into the workplace, all of this stuff, and doing exactly what a man is doing, is actually affecting their lives in the negative. Now I thought maybe, okay, this is maybe all the feministic confessions, that's one thing. Maybe this study is a coincidence as well. So I started looking deeper into the issue, and I found that this was something almost every study that I've seen on the issue has said the same thing about. For example, there is a study by the Policy Studies Institute that has come to the same conclusion, that well-being for women has deteriorated in the last 60 years. There was even a magazine called Top Sartre magazine, which polled women's health. 78% of recipients, women, they said if they could, they would quit their job tomorrow. Imagine having a workforce, 80% almost of the workforce of women, they want to leave. They don't like it. It's a prison for them. Isn't this an irony? Because this is exactly what Betty Friedan said. You need to leave your comfortable concentration camp, your prison. The home is the prison. But now women are saying en masse in the West that actually what's the prison is the work. 78%. 78% of recipients, women, all women, said if they could, they would quit their jobs tomorrow. 80% of the same magazine, they said that their job has led to psychological breakdown, nervous breakdown, has led to deteriorated mental conditions. 80%. 80. Now, I want you to ask you a question. If we got the same, and I don't think the study has been done, if we got a study of women, all of which have been mothers, and they were full-time mothers in the home with the children, do you think, honestly, that 80% would want to stop being mothers? Honestly, do you think this?
Okay, so let me stop there, guys, because I thought it was very interesting. So he mentioned a longitudinal study taking place over 20 years, in which 100,000 women were polled, and it found that the welfare of women has decreased. And the same conclusion was found by, I believe it was the Policy Studies Institute, is what he mentioned. They found the same conclusion. And then in addition to that, a magazine, Paul Sartre magazine, I believe he said, did a poll and found 78% of working women in the workforce, said if they could, they would quit tomorrow. So they felt that the job was more imprisoning. Yeah, so it led to a decrease in women's overall welfare. Right? Took them out of the home, which, Betty, like he mentioned, Betty Friedan, she was initially saying that, you need to leave your comfortable concentration camp. And, the point he goes on to explain is that, if you're in the home caring for your own children, there's a joyful satisfaction in that. One, your child isn't going to fire you, and you take direct ownership and pride over it because it's your child. So anyway, I don't want to get too much into the family and relationship aspect of it, because again, this is not that type of channel. But I wanted to at least cover his points on the philosophical and scholarly foundations for how these ideas came to be, and the people, right, who originated these ideas. The Simone de Beauvoir, Betty Friedan, Germaine Greer, to name some names. So there's a last point that I wanted to get to, and then we can break that down.
Plane taken off and then it crashes. Okay, well, let's go to the next one. No thanks. We don't need to try that again. And many women know already how this feels. Many of you will have gone to work and tried that life, and you forget how it made you feel. Or that you've never tried with motherhood and you think that this is better than this. Or that, and I don't think I'm going to find a woman that says, I'd rather be a career woman than a mother. I've never yet met her. The woman that says, if she's a mother, she says, I'm going to leave my career. Because the thing is, your child can't say to you, you're fired. You've done your job now. You've done your thing. And the thing is, it's so ironic, isn't it? That a lot of career orientation means that when you go to work, there's going to be a man there telling you what to do. So it's the same kind of thing as a hierarchy, his policies and all this kind of thing. Maybe in this very university, which is meant to be pluralistic, maybe the head of it is a man. I don't know. Maybe 2 men, 3 men. Or maybe in your, in the department is a man telling you what to do. Who cares if it's a man or a woman telling you what to do? You'll always have someone telling you what to do. You cannot avoid this point. So I don't know what you're gaining, what one would gain, really, by way of trying the career option as an opportunity cost, or using it or choosing it above and beyond a child and having a nurturing relationship, which is the deepest thing. Think about it for a second. Let's be emotional for a second, yeah? And this will be the last thing I will say. Many women, if they have young babies, it's not incredulous for us to believe that they would put their own life on the line to protect their children, correct? Something that is so meaningful, that would make you die to protect your own child. That. How can this be compared? We couldn't accept that a woman would die for her company. Especially if she's, sorry to say, but she's working in a lower position. I can't imagine someone working in McDonald's. You have McDonald's here, I don't know, or Belgian waffle shop. And then a guy comes and says, give me all the waffles. And she says, not when I'm here. She says, not when I'm here. I'm going to die for this one. Yes. Or she's working in McDonald's. She's flipping some pancakes or burgers or something and this and that. And someone comes and says, no, give me 2 barbecue sauces. Give me 2, 3. No, I'm going to take it by force. No, you're not. I'm going to come out and I'm going to fight you for it to the death. The reason why a woman wouldn't do that is genuinely because she does not value, for the most part, women do not value their careers as much as they could ever value children that they have. And that's the bottom line, to be honest with you. And that itself is a proof that you'll be wasting your time if you choose A over B. And I'm not saying, therefore, women shouldn't work and stay at home and, no, there's...
Okay, so, yeah, he really explained that point well, in that, at the end of the day, and we mentioned the surveys and the philosophers that sort of set the stage for all this, but, as I mentioned, the studies have been done that a general welfare of women has declined over the years, ever since the second and third wave of feminism have come to the forefront. And he mentioned something really, really important, and I really believe this. The vast majority of women in the workforce, they would really find more purpose in their life through raising children. Really, I mean, that or working a job. I mean, think about most women who work in the workforce, whether they're working at McDonald's or Subway, or they're a physical therapist, or they're it can range the gamut in terms of educated to non-educated jobs, whether they're in service jobs, working as a hotel clerk, what have you. I mean, there's a range of jobs where many women work in the service sector, healthcare sector, and so on. Yet, in a previous study, like I mentioned, 78% said they would leave their jobs tomorrow. Nearly 80%. So okay, the 20% of those, go get them girls, they're always going to be there, and more power to them. I'm not against that whatsoever, and I support that. But the vast majority of women say they want to leave the workforce, right? This is the previous study I mentioned, the magazine study. 78%. So rather than work at a meaningless job that you get no meaning from, right? That doesn't provide you anything deeper in life, likely the family and the kids would provide you that deeper meaning. Just a thought. But anyway, not to focus too much on that. Like I said, this is not a relationship type of channel, but I think all of that was really the great foundation, both the information we got from Dr. T. Hassan Johnson and also from Muhammad Hijab, is that it sets the great foundation to understand the historical and the philosophical foundations, right, that get us to the situation that we're in terms of the relationships, or the relationship between black men and black women in this country. And ultimately, guys, I mean, the reason why I dove into this topic is because, at the base of it, right, what forms a good community? Families form a good community, right? If at the base of it, if you have dysfunctioning families, right, you're not going to have a functioning community. And overall, you're not going to have a functioning society as a people, right? So you have to fix things at the root level. And another thing I want to mention is, according, the last statistic was taken in 2015, according to Wikipedia, that the single mother rate in the black community, the African American community, was at 77.3%, nearly 80% of homes in the black community, the African American community, single mother homes. And one can think, what type of long-term effects does this have? Well, I could bring up, one study from the BBC in which they did a larger study, and this study was done by a woman by the name of Sarah McLanahan. If you guys want to look that up, again, I got this from the BBC. Sarah McLanahan. They did this study both in the U.S. and the U.K., but I'll focus on the U.S. study because it includes both African Americans and Hispanic Americans primarily, because they went to large city centers and polled a lot of single parent households and so on. So I think it's relevant for what we're talking about, since we are focusing on African Americans. And one of the things that the study mentioned was that one of the findings was that there's certainly a lot of challenges to single parent households, and she found that the households were likely to do worse on some measures as compared to kids that come from a married household. So having two adults who can cooperate and raise a child and give more time and money means that they can give more resources. That's what the study found. And so, overall, basically that was the finding of the study, was that, kids who lack that stability of a two-parent household, they're more likely to do worse on some measures than a child coming from a married couple. It's just that, those two parents are able to, provide more resources. So, kind of from the beginning, if you're at 80% single parent households, you have a lot of children, starting at a disadvantage, basically. So, and there's many more studies about this, about the nuclear family, guys. If you're interested, please go out there and, do the research. But like I said, guys, you can't have a strong community, right, unless you have strong families. Yeah. You can't have a strong society unless you have strong communities, and you can't have strong communities unless you have strong families. So that's the whole point. And so if we really want to change the situation in Black America, especially if we see, the situation with a lot of, unruly kids, in terms of our school, I'm a veteran of a lot of, poor Black schools. Let's be honest, a lot of disrespect, a lot of dysfunction, a lot of kids not paying attention, not being focused. And then you hear stories from the past how, when kids would behave like that, they would get a whooping from the whole community. But that's not, around anymore. And obviously in the past, the father was more present in the home. But we're having a trend now where, we're not having that stability in the home, and it's leaching out and having a wider effect across the entire community and therefore the entire society. So anyway, guys, I wanted to just share those ideas with you guys, at least get some scholarly basis for all this. I thought these two videos were very had a lot of great information. So anyway, guys, please like and subscribe, ring the bell if you like this content. I really appreciate all you guys who tune in and watch this stuff. And until next time, thank you, guys.